Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee's online worship service. I'm Reverend Dina McFeeters, and I'm honored to serve as Associate Minister. We welcome people of all genders, sexualities, ages, races, ethnicities, histories, and bodies. We welcome your mind, your heart, and your spirit. We welcome all that you are carrying with you today and all that you long to set down. We'd like to pay a special welcome to guests joining us today. If you are visiting for the first time or joining us from afar today, why don't you say hello in the chat and tell us where you're joining us from. I welcome you to our worship service by inviting you to repeat our mission after me. We gather to nurture the spirit, engage the mind, and inspire action. These opening words are a land acknowledgement written by our Minister of Religious Education, Reverend Kimberly Tomchek Carlson, which she uses every week with our children and families. Let us now acknowledge that the land we live on was once the land of the Native or Indigenous people of Wisconsin. We do this with the intention of grounding us in the truth of our shared history and the goal of healing the harm that has been done and continues. The land was originally populated by many Indigenous people who lived and thrived in an interdependent relationship with the land and the other beings here, long before white colonial settlement. The Indigenous people are still here and are still connected to this land. Many of our names, including the name Wisconsin, come from the original people of these lands: the Kickapoo, the Peoria, the Potawatomi, the Miami, and the Sioux. Let's return to our beloved sanctuary for the lighting of the flaming chalice, symbol of Unitarian Universalism.
I'm the Reverend Kimberly, and it's my honor to serve you as the Minister of Religious Education. The story I have for you today is called When We Were Alone, and it's by David Robertson and Julie Flett. Today, I helped my kukum in her flower garden. She always wears colorful clothes. It's like she dresses in rainbows. When she bent down to prune some of the flowers, I couldn't see her because she blended in with them. She was like a chameleon. Newcomb, why do you wear so many colors? I asked. Newcomb said, well, Nosisim, when I was your age, at home in my community, my friends and I wore many colors. But at school, the school I went to, far away from home, they gave us different clothes to wear. All the children were dressed the same, and our clothes weren't colorful at all. We all mixed together like storm clouds. Why did you have to dress like that? I asked. They didn't like that we wore such beautiful colors, Newcomb said. They wanted us to look like everyone else. But sometimes in the fall, when we were alone and the leaves had turned their warm autumn hues, we would roll around on the ground. We would pile the leaves over the clothes they had given us, and we would be colorful again. And this made us happy. Now, Newcomb said, I always wear the most beautiful colors. After I helped with the garden, we went over to the back gate, and there were vines covering the gate, and they reached all the way to the ground. When my kukum turned to fix the latch, I saw that her braid hung almost as low as the vines. It was like she had a tail. Newcomb, why do you wear your hair so long? I asked. Newcomb said, well, Nosicium, when I was your age at home in my community, my friends and I grew our hair long, just like our people have always done. It made us feel strong and proud. But at the school I went to, far from home, they cut off all our hair. Our strands of hair mixed together on the ground like blades of dead grass. Why did you have to wear your hair like that? I asked. They didn't like that we were proud, Newcomb said. They wanted us to be like everyone else. But sometimes in the spring, when we were alone and the grass had grown so long and thick in the field, we would pick the blades from the ground. We would braid them into short hair they had given us, and we would have long hair again. And this made us happy. Now, Newcomb said, I always wear my hair very long. After my Newcomb had fixed the latch, I followed her to the birdhouse. There was a bird flying through the air like a jingle-dress dancer. She fed the bird, and then she whispered, Na pina sis mikaso, tama sitin kin tamisi kitin. Her words sounded like a poem. They meant, here, little bird, eat, so you will get big and strong. Newcomb, why do you speak in Cree? Newcomb said, well, Nosicium, when I was your age, at home in my community, my friends and I always spoke in our language. But at school I went to, far away from home, they wouldn't let us speak our words. All the children used their strange words, and we didn't understand them at all. Our voices blended together like a flock of crows. Why did you have to talk in their language? I asked. They didn't like it when we spoke in our language, said Newcomb. They wanted us to talk like everyone else. But sometimes in the summer, when we were alone and our teachers weren't anywhere around the place we were, we could whisper to each other in Cree. We would say all the words we weren't allowed to say so that we wouldn't forget them. And this made us happy. Now, Newcomb said, I always speak my language. After our gardening work was done, I sat alone with my Newcomb in the backyard. Her brother came over and sat with us. He comes over all the time. We drank tea and bannock. The tea was hot and sweet, and the bannock was moist and warm and melted in my mouth. My Kokum and my uncle talked and laughed like children. Newcomb, why do you and Nokomis always spend time together? I asked. Newcomb said, well, Nosicium, when we were your age, at home in our community, being family was the most important thing. We played with each other, did chores together, and shared everything. But at the school I went to, far away from home, they wouldn't let us be together. My brother and I were separated like day and night. Why were you and Nokomis separated? I asked. They didn't like us with family because when we were together, we thought too much of home. But in the winter, when we were alone and we were sure no one could see us, we would find each other. We would take off our mitts, and in the crisp, cold air, we would hold hands so we could be with each other. This made us happy. Now, Newcomb said as she reached over and held my uncle's hand and mine, I am always with my family. The end.
Oh, thank you for that story, Kimberly. Hmm. We have some family news for our Candle of Life this morning. I'm happy to say that members Katie and Noel Cagle welcomed the birth of their child, Athena Astor Cagle, on June 11th, 2021. Parents and baby are all doing well. We were honored to hold the child dedication ceremony for this family at our outdoor in-person worship service last Sunday, November 14th, in the snow. So that is an event that will go down in family lore, as is our custom in this church whenever we have a birth or adoption or a death among our members. We light our candle of life. Today, in honor of Athena Aster Kegel. Take a deep breath with me, dear ones, as we enter into a time of spoken meditation, followed by silence, followed by singing Spirit of Life. I invite you to find a way wherever you are to ground yourself, however that works for you. Perhaps you can put your feet on the floor. Maybe find a way to lift your spine so you can breathe a little more deeply. Spirit of life and love, all that is holy within, among, and beyond us. It's been a tense week of waiting and hoping for justice, reliving painful memories of homicide in the streets of Kenosha. As the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse unfolded, in the days since the jury's verdict was delivered, many strong emotions coursed through us. Anger, disgust, disappointment, disbelief, or grim predictability, sadness, grief, numbness, moral outrage, frustration, renewed resolve to change the system, and also pervading fear. We wonder what will happen next. We know the message acquittal sends is unacceptable. It is unacceptable to send a message that it's okay for civilians to carry assault rifles in public and use them at will. We fear the extent of vigilantism in our country. We grieve with the families of the victims. And we love on the people of Kenosha. We pray that Kyle Rittenhouse recognize that he is not morally exonerated. We pray that he cease from violence. The news, as news does, also falls into lives filled with personal woes of illness, loss of loved ones, financial stress, pandemic fatigue, loneliness, and also joy at birth of babies and family reunions. There are seasons in which it is challenging to feel grateful. In this season of Thanksgiving, may we find a small thing to be grateful for. And may we find a large hope to work for that brings us closer to healing history and building a future, justice, and peace. May it be so.
Good morning. My name is Yolanda Ludke, and I am pleased to serve as your worship associate today. We all have deeply complex and personal histories, and we hold our history in different ways. In my own history, there is a struggle with mental health, body image, and self-worth. There is a history of unbearable grief and loss, but equally, there is a history of proud moments, joy, privileges, and so much warmth and love. Much of that coming from you, my first church family. My history has taught me that I am resilient. I have learned to shape hardships into strength and hope. I have had to continue to push back when I am knocked down or when things don't work out. I hold my history and honor justice because I am curating a legacy of love. This week, many Americans will hear a false narrative of the history of our Thanksgiving holiday. The story of a peaceful coexistence between indigenous people and pilgrims. But the real history is more complicated and contains betrayal, cruelty, and heartbreak. What do we perpetuate if we don't speak up and tell the truth? I believe I have been assigned to play the role of disruptor, both professionally and personally. It's not always easy, and sometimes I do it wrong, but sometimes I do it right. After George Floyd was murdered, our world seemingly turned upside down and inside out. When faced with the option to quietly accept the lack of response from the school district and superintendent I was employed by, or the building principal and program director I worked closely with, or speak up and risk the consequences, I spoke up. I wrote strongly worded and specific emails to all personnel in the administrative offices. I called a meeting with my building principal and program director. I demanded a formal stance on anti-racism in the early childhood program and beyond. I made sure my Black and Brown families knew I was standing in solidarity and support with them, that I was fighting for a reckoning with the truth. The result? I helped form a committee with primary focus to remove problematic books from the curriculum and replace them with BIPOC-centric and anti-racist books. This effort changed the narrative for the students, parents, and teachers at my school and empowered them all to hold history and create a new story for the future in a different way. I have an obligation to leave my community better and stronger than I found it. I have learned to be resilient in shifting power, to fight for justice by pushing back against the status quo, and share space by loving. I challenge you today, think about your personal history and ask yourself, how can I do the same? What good can I do when I learn from history?
When I was an undergrad women's studies major, devouring women's literature and books about women's history, I came upon the work of Maridel Lesueur. Her family's official website states she was one of the great women literary and communal voices of the 20th century, which her long life spanned. Maridel was born on February 22nd, 1900, in Murray, Iowa, and died in Hudson, Wisconsin on November 14th, 1996. She believed in giving voice to people's struggles. She said she learned early to write down what they were saying, hiding behind water troughs in the streets, under tables at home, listening to the tales of the lives of the people. Her writings were grounded in these grassroots, salt of the earth stories and experiences of working people, of the poor, the disenfranchised, the dispossessed. She strove to make history a living, moving entity in our lives. She once said that words should heat you. They should make you rise up out of your chair and move. Since my grandmother was Lesueur's contemporary, was also born in Iowa, and since my grandma and grandpa were involved in the labor movement in Minnesota, like Lesueur, I gave my grandma a collection of Maridel's stories. Grandma read the stories and told me, "This book is terrible. She writes about terrible things." I was surprised and startled by her response. Grandma didn't want to hear about the painful parts of women's history, even in the form of fiction. The stories of family violence, alcoholism, rape, incest. She didn't want to believe these things happened, especially out on the prairie. I loved my grandma and admired her courage and outspokenness in many areas of her life. But in this instance, Grandma wasn't skilled in holding both the beauty and the ugly of history. Not many of us are skilled in that art. Yet, as Unitarian Universalists, our faith calls us to practice the art of holding history, both the positive and the negative, and the tension between, as we connect the dots and allow history to transform us. Moving to a new city is an opportunity to learn and reflect on how history shapes the identity of the community. When I moved to Milwaukee in 2009, people were quick to tell me about Joshua Glover. But it took years before I heard about George Marshall Clark. Which of these men from Milwaukee history have you heard about? At America's Black Holocaust Museum online, an article by scholar griots Maria Cunningham and Jordan Davis asks, how does a city choose to remember its past? They wrote, in 1854, Milwaukee abolitionists defied the law to rescue Joshua Glover. Glover, a former enslaved African American from Missouri, found sanctuary in the state of Wisconsin in 1852, less than 10 years before the outbreak of the US Civil War. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which gave slaveholders a legal right to capture runaway African Americans residing in the North and return them south of the Mason-Dixon line, a law compelling every citizen to aid in their arrests. When Benamy Garland of St. Louis, Glover's alleged owner, made his case in February 1854, he received a court order and a warrant for Glover's arrest. After learning about Glover's residence in nearby Racine, Wisconsin, Glover was apprehended and brought to the Milwaukee courthouse and jail, originally located at the present-day site of Cathedral Square Park. On the eve of March 11, 1854, a large crowd would break into Milwaukee's jail, rescue the captured Glover, and help him escape to Canada through the Underground Railroad. And while Sherman Booth, Milwaukee's most prominent abolitionist, would be brought to court for his participation in Glover's rescue, Glover's story set in motion a profound change in the political landscape. In 1855, Wisconsin's Supreme Court became the first and only high legal body to declare the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 unconstitutional, a ruling later overruled by the US Supreme Court. And Joshua Glover would spend the next 34 years in Canada and freedom until his death in 1888. Their account is a story to celebrate, where people took action on the right side of history, which is probably why I heard about it soon after moving to Milwaukee. The story of George Marshall Clark is deeply painful and ended badly, and that's probably why it isn't told as often. Clark was lynched. Cunningham and Davis wrote, Clark was the only African American to have been lynched in the state and the only lynching to happen in the city of Milwaukee. George Marshall Clark, who went by Marshall Clark, was 22 years old and an apprentice barber under his father, George H. Clark. His father was a leading figure in the Black community and was described as a very respectable man. The trouble began the evening of Friday, September 6, 1861. Marshall Clark and his friend James Shelton were walking in downtown Milwaukee, escorting two white women. Shelton, 28, was a waiter at a nearby ice cream establishment. He was described as a man with a quiet, orderly disposition who hardly ever drinks anything. Two Irishmen, Dabney Carney and John Brady, seeing the young men with the women, made an offensive remark. A fight began between the four men, ending when Shelton pulled a knife and stabbed Carney in the abdomen and slashed Brady. Clark and Shelton ran, but were later captured and placed in the county jail. Dabney Carney died from his wounds on Saturday evening. Before Carney died, he identified Shelton as the man who had stabbed him. News about Carney's death spread fast, and the city's Irish population set out for revenge. A fire alarm sounded as a signal, and within an hour, a mob had gathered and headed for the jail. The mob grabbed some heavy timber, and after 18 barges, was able to break down the iron door. Clark and Shelton were housed at the back of the jail in a room next to two adjoining cells. When Shelton heard the crowd coming, he slipped into one of the adjoining cells, closed the door, and hid, leaving Clark alone with the crowd. Despite Clark's pleas that he was not Shelton and had nothing to do with the murder, the mob was convinced they had the right man and lynched him on Buffalo Street in the 3rd Ward. The state of Wisconsin charged 6 men with the lynching of Marshall Clark. The trial began November 14, 1861. After 3 days of testimony, the case was turned over to the jurors. After 2.5 days of deliberation, They were unable to reach a final verdict. The trial for the only lynching in Milwaukee history resulted in a hung jury. The end of Cunningham and Davis's article addresses the topic of how we hold history. They wrote, in 2001, the Wisconsin Historical Society installed a historical marker commemorating the rescue of Joshua Glover in Cathedral Square Park. In 2005, a mural of Glover's rescue and escape was installed downtown on Fond du Lac Avenue under the I-43 overpass, a former route of the Underground Railroad. Both the rescue of Joshua Glover and the racial lynching of Marshall Clark had a dramatic impact on the city and Milwaukee's emerging African American community, yet only one is commemorated. How does a society select what events are commemorated? Should we only remember stories that support our sense of interracial cooperation or progressive values? Or should we also commemorate the horrific events of racial trauma that complicate our uplifting stories of the past? As a city, we have chosen to remember Joshua Glover. Should we remember Clark? In the years since that essay appeared, Black people in Milwaukee advocated for a historical marker at the site of the lynching at Buffalo and Water Street. The Milwaukee County Historical Society designated the site an historical landmark in 2018. Also, through the efforts of Tyrone Randall Jr., a young Black artist and activist who discovered that Clark was buried in an unmarked grave at Forest Home Cemetery, a headstone for Clark was recently installed with ceremony on September 8, 2021, exactly 160 years after he was murdered. Is it amazing or remarkable that this took so long to publicly commemorate the painful history of Marshall Clark? Perhaps not. History's horrors are often avoided or silenced. The traumatic past is hard to hear and can be re-stimulating of trauma in the present. History's horrors also demand of us a reckoning. History is more than facts. It involves interpretation and the crucial power of the teller. One definition of history states, history is what happened and the study of what happened. It is inquiry, story, judge. There is an old saying that history is told by the victors. I believe that in order to find and understand the truth of history, we need to hear inquiry and story from all voices, not just the victors. Then we can use our capacity for critical thinking and judge truth for ourselves. You are probably aware of the debate raging across the country in school boards and legislatures over critical race theory. The Wisconsin Assembly passed Bill 411 banning the teaching of critical race theory on September 28, 2021, and sent it to the Wisconsin Senate. This bill prohibits anti-racism and anti-sexism instruction in Wisconsin K-12 schools and prohibits anti-racism and anti-sexism training of district employees. It includes a list of more than 20 words or phrases that would be banned in classrooms under the threat of losing state aid for schools. Words we say all the time, words like equity, intersectionality, institutional bias, land acknowledgement, patriarchy, systemic racism, and so forth. Critical race theory is a legal framework developed by Derek Bell at Harvard Law School in the 1970s and 80s. It's an academic theory that looks at whether systems and policies perpetuate racism. The theory claims that racism does not just manifest in individual bigotry, but in institutional systems. To be clear, the current debate about critical race theory is not primarily an educator's debate. It is grounded in some white people's fear of telling the truth about history and the moral reckoning that provokes. Christopher Rufo and his conservative think tank latched onto the name in recent years while criticizing diversity trainings because they teach white people to hate themselves. Rufo asked then President Trump to ban critical race theory in federal workforce trainings, which he did. In an NPR podcast in July 2021, Gloria Ladson Billings, president of the National Academy of Educators and a professor at UW-Madison, called critical race theory a red herring. She said the name is used to start up culture wars and shows up in the same locations with voter suppression laws. In response to the Wisconsin Assembly passing Bill 411, Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel columnist James Causey wrote on September 30th, "Who is responsible to teach children about race and racism? Parents, schools, and society. According to a USA Today poll, 60% of parents want their children to learn about slavery and racism in school. You can't teach a sanitized version of race and racism and expect anything to change." Jabari S. Jones wrote in a post on the UUA website, "One thing I've learned is that at the core of white privilege is the entitlement to amnesia and ignorance, to forget that America was founded on stolen land, stolen labor, and genocide, and that we live in a society structured by this history, is to embrace an identity rooted in false innocence and a flight from truth and healing. This is the rot at the root of the nation." I wonder if you know that in 2016, Unitarian Universalists voted to pay special attention to learning our history and rethinking Thanksgiving in the year 2020 in observance of the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims' Landing in Plymouth. During a worship service called Thanksgiving Reframed 1 year ago, UUA President Reverend Susan Frederick Gray told a difficult truth in her sermon. She wrote, "Historically, UU ministers were instrumental in creating this US holiday and the Pilgrims and Indians pageant tradition that roots the holiday in a historically inaccurate and harmful colonial narrative. Many UU congregations in New England can trace their lineage directly back to early settler congregations that had a role in the genocide of Native communities. As a religious tradition, we cannot decide who we will be without reckoning with the truth of who some of our ancestors were. An important piece of this work is examining and debunking the Thanksgiving myth and owning our tradition's role in its creation." In David Silverman's essay, Mourning in America, from the book, This Land is Their Land, Silverman traces the history of the holiday. While the Wampanoag celebrated many seasonal Thanksgivings to celebrate the earth's bounty and the Creator's many gifts, The first Thanksgivings observed by the Pilgrims and the Puritans focused on days of fasting and prayer to thank God for the plagues that wiped out a huge percentage of the indigenous population in many villages, including all of the Wampanoag population in Patuxent or Plymouth. Eventually, colonial New Englanders began to celebrate each spring and autumn with days of Thanksgiving. These celebrations, particularly the autumn ones, eventually spread to other areas in the 1800s. None of these celebrations were associated with the Pilgrims or with Indigenous people. The first time this association was made was in 1841, when New England-born Unitarian minister, Reverend Alexander Young, published Pilgrim Leader Edward Winslow's only primary source account of the 1621 Pilgrim and Wampanoag gathering in Plymouth, consisting of only 4 lines. However, Reverend Young added a footnote to the paragraph, stating that this was the first Thanksgiving, the harvest festival of New England. And so the myth began. It's hard to hear that Unitarians had something to do with creating the first Thanksgiving myth and its consequences. Well, there's more that's hard to hear. You may wonder why Reverend Kimberly told a story for all ages today about the impact of Indian boarding schools on a family. Although it is important to know that painful history as a people of conscience, you might think that it has nothing to do with us specifically as a UU faith community, but it does. In the late 1800s, Unitarians ran 2 Indian boarding schools, which affected 3,800 Indigenous children and their families. Reverend Suzelle Lynch, minister at UUCW in Brookfield, Wisconsin, explains the background. In the 1870s, President Ulysses S. Grant set out a new policy toward Native Americans that invited religious organizations to apply to operate the Indian agencies located on reservations throughout the country. Why invite religious denominations to help with this? Grant's administration believed religious folks would be less prone to corruption and more successful in advancing Indian assimilation via religious conversion. The American Unitarian Association took responsibility for 2 agencies working on Ute Indian reservations in Colorado. 5 men, including 4 ministers, served as Indian agents, carrying out US government policy, which essentially forced the Utes to choose between assimilation and annihilation. Less than a decade later, the American Unitarian Association established the Montana Industrial School for Indians on a Crow reservation in that state. It was a boarding school for Native American children. And of course, we know the purpose of these boarding schools was to strip culture and language from these vulnerable children so they would assimilate if they survived. Friends, you know, I am a cradle to grave Unitarian Universalist, but I did not learn this history until a few years ago while participating in the beloved Conversations group at First Church. This painful UU history was suppressed for most of my lifetime. My religious identity was rooted in false innocence. Some of you know I grew up going to a UU summer family camp in northern Minnesota. Since the age of 4, I've been connected to and love that land. as a child going on hikes with my family in the Chippewa National Forest, I was shown the shallow, round indentations in the earth that appeared along the trail, rice pits where native Ojibwa people stored wild rice long ago. In my young child's mind, I thought of the orange box of Uncle Ben's white rice that we used at home and tried to imagine what it would be like to store rice in the earth. My family joined other families in canoes paddling to the point of the island to harvest clay for arts activities. We also looked for potsherds in the sand, evidence of human inhabitants from long ago. Who were they? What happened to the native people who lived here where I now camped with my family and played with my friends? Likely died from smallpox, my parents said. But no adult that I recall took it upon themselves as a responsibility to trace a line between the far history of the Ojibwa village on the island and the near history of life on the Leech Lake Indian Reservation today. The history of the summer camp conveyed to me began with the white people who purchased the land as a summer home for their extended family. I learned that near history of the Anderson family from Texas, who looked for a beautiful and cooler place to spend the summer in the 1920s. I learned of their connection to a Unitarian doctor from Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, who treated a family member. When the Andersons aged out of their summer paradise and air conditioning was installed in Texas in the 1950s, the Unitarian doctor's wife, Alicia Claggett, convinced the Andersons to donate their property to the Universalists and the Unitarians for the development of a family camp in 1961. The minister of the Unitarian church I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, was instrumental in organizing and generating enthusiasm among the families in the church to become some of the first campers. My parents jumped at the opportunity in 1964, and there, our love for the place grew and blossomed. My parents contributed thousands of hours of volunteer labor toward the maintenance of the camp and its community of people over the decades. So did my sister and I. Camp became inextricably part of our identity. I am embarrassed to say that it was only in the last 10 years that I wondered where the Anderson family wealth came from and learned they were part of the largest cotton brokerage in the world and traveled to their summer home with 5 Black servants. It is only recently that I began to wonder how the current generation of Ojibwe people feel about the largely white Unitarian Universalists owning land in the Chippewa National Forest within their Leech Lake Reservation. It's only very recently when a 3rd-generation camper researched the far history of camp as the focus of her undergraduate thesis that the connections were made between the far history and the near history. Anya Steinberg wrote and produced a podcast series called Where the Red Cedar Grows, A Reckoning 400 Years in the Making. At the end of the series, she places a moral challenge before the campers by asking, should we give the land back? Which is essentially a question of reparations. I am puzzled and ashamed that it's only recently that I began to confront the impact of the hard truths of Northern Minnesota history on Indigenous people, and thus the impact of the camp, which resides simultaneously on Indian land and at the center of my heart and soul. Why did it take so long, my entire lifetime really, to learn and hold this history? Because it's easier not to, I suppose. It's easier not to confront what my attachment to a place that is my spirit's home, a place that feels like mine, really means, and what I may need to give up to be in right relationship with Indigenous people today. I share my personal journey with humility and in growing acknowledgement of the ways that my spiritual, emotional, and family identity is embedded in a painful history of systemic racism. We live in both the beauty and the ugly of history and the tension between. What does this have to do with church? Biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann wrote, "The prophetic tasks of the church are to tell the truth in a society that lives in illusion, grieve in a society that practices denial, and express hope in a society that lives in despair." Friends, we need each other to do these tasks and to be church. I am so grateful to be in it with you.
When the ground drops out from under you and there's nothing there to hold on to, no, you're not the first to fall right through to a space of mystery, a place of questioning who you are and who you're meant to be. When you can't find home where it used to be, and your roots have faded into memory, no, you're not alone in this new reality. It's a well-trod path traveled by ancestors who came before and show the way. Throughout time, we've been pushed into the dark, called to find the light within our broken hearts and let it shine. And we can't do it on our own, gotta find our family in the unknown. And side by side we'll go by, stepping stone till the journey becomes our home. Some days it feels like searching for water in the sand. Sometimes it feels like falling with nowhere to land. Yeah, there are ups and downs that'll turn you round and round. We come back to the footprints, they're all around. And throughout time, we've been pushed into the dark, called to find the light within our broken hearts and let it shine. And we can't do it on our own, gotta find our family in the unknown. And side by side we'll go by, stepping stone till the journey becomes our home. When the walls are closing in, we find our way out through the door into a light that's so much brighter than our hearts have known before. as wanderers and warriors of the soul. And throughout time, we've been pushed into the dark, cold to find. Throughout time, we've been pushed into the dark, cold to find the light within our broken hearts and let it shine. And we can't do it on our own, gotta find our family in the unknown. And side by side we'll go by stepping stone till the journey becomes, yes, the journey becomes our
Thank you all so much for your generosity. Pledges are at the core of our church's spiritual practice of generosity. We are also grateful for additional gifts to support our ministry and thank the folks out there who are appreciating this online ministry and supporting it by texting 73256 with the message "Give to UU," or by giving on our website at bit.ly/UU ways to give. Your gifts help us continue to provide this ministry. We also share the plate with an organization each month. In November, our Share the Plate partner is Law Forward, Inc., a nonpartisan, nonprofit impact litigation firm committed to protecting and advancing democracy. Law Forward is committed to protecting voting rights, advancing fair legislative districts, while resisting gerrymandering in Wisconsin, and more. I encourage you to give to Law Forward and support democracy in this way. To get more involved, join our Defend Democracy team here at First Church. Find out what is happening to democracy in Wisconsin and what you can do to help. Information can be found on our website or by contacting members Kathy Rivera or Nick Hayes. You can give to our Share the Plate partner through the same webpage at bit.ly/UU ways to give. You can see the ways to donate on your screen now, and they will live on in the YouTube comments section of this video after worship is over. Thank you so much for giving right now or when you come back later. Your support truly keeps us and our community partners going. Thank you. Friends, these closing words are by Meridel LeSueur from her work, North Star Country. The people are a story that never ends, a river that winds and falls and gleams erect in many dawns. Lost in deep gullies, it turns to dust, rushes in the spring freshet, emerges to the sea. The people are a story that is a long, incessant coming alive from the earth in better wheat, percherons, babies, and engines, persistent and inevitable. The people always know that some of the grain will be good, some of the crop will be saved, some will return and bear the strength of the kernel, that from the bloodiest year, some survive to outfox the frost. Amen, and may it be so.
We are going Heaven knows where we are going. We know within, and we will get there. Heaven knows how we will get there, but we know we will. Whoa, yeah, yeah. Whoa, yeah, yeah. Whoa, yeah, yeah. Whoa, yeah, yeah. Whoa, yeah, yeah.